Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Yokish, and I am the executive producer of Open Source Stories here at Red Hat. Thank you so much for joining us today for our film premiere. I'm joined today by 3 of the experts that you just saw in the film, and we are going to host a panel for you so we can ask them some questions that we've prepared and then open it up to the audience, any questions that you may have for them as well. So you met them on the film already, but we've got Dorn Cox, the research director of Wolf's Neck's Center for Agriculture and the Environment, also co-founder of FarmOS, of Goat, and FarmHack. We've got Melanie Shimano. She is the founder of the Food Computer Program, founder and director of the Food Computer Program. And we've got Peter Webb. He is co-founder and CEO of Mars Farm. So thank you all 3 for being here. So we'll start off with a question for all of you. We saw a lot of the tools, the open source tools that you use on the film, and we also know, of course, that community and collaboration are so key to open source. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the communities that you work with for your work. So Dorn, we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think you mentioned some of them that I've been directly involved in creating, but none of those, Goat or FarmHack, could exist without the history of open source projects and collaboration software that actually made that possible. So it's building on a huge legacy of open source tools that really make the internet work. So it's, it's GitHub and GitLab and, the Raspberry, and on the hardware side and the sensor side. And so we're really dependent on this larger ecosystem that's supporting, supporting our collaboration. And I could go on. There's so many. Yeah. I mean, in FarmOS is based on Drupal, which is also using OpenLayers, which is and a lot of the other projects are using Leaflet, and it just it goes on and on. Yeah. So it really is the community supported a product of the community.
That's great, Melanie.
Yeah, totally. Like building on that, I think. The communities are what actually makes these projects successful. So I wouldn't have had this Food Computer Program if it wasn't for the open source communities. It was founded, so the MIT Media Lab group, the OpenAg, started the Food Computer Project, or Food Computer, project. And so through that and the community that spawned from it, this huge forum of people talking about stuff, I met Peter kind of offline, or online, I guess, and was able to build on top of that in the classes, and then through that was able to explore different open source communities, like the Raspberry Pi Certified Educator community, where I had also met Chris and Chantal, who are in the film. And so it's kind of cool to say, okay, we're able to do this thing, and I can connect with these people online, and then as I move into different groups, you're seeing other people doing similar things, and then kind of connecting the worlds together, and then building bigger things on top of that. So community, the open source communities in general are super key in order to making sure that these things actually work.
Yeah, and for me, by the time I had found the Food Computer Project, I already had a wall of plants in my bedroom. And it's hard to put into words the validation that I felt by finding my community. I no longer felt like the crazy kid with plants in his bedroom, but felt like I was onto something, and MIT was interested in this technology as well. So that it was really the community that enabled me to find people like Melanie, even people in St. Louis who had already built food computers that I could go visit and see and meet with, and I now still have strong relationships with. My contribution back to the community was the minimum viable product, or $300 food computer project, where we really tried to reduce the complexity. And that was a team project with both local collaborators and online collaborators that took on a life of its own, and it's now been built at least 200 times that we know of. And groups in South Korea, for instance, are developing computer vision software now to identify how many leaves are there, what's the width, length, area of the leaves. So it's really incredible to see how, by creating an open source platform, it's been continually iterative product that now is able to become the foundation for our company. So that community is instrumental.
Yeah, of Of course.
I just wanted to add that one of the first things we did in our gathering for Open Ag Tech was start to map our technical ecosystems together, and we identified 71 open source agricultural projects in our first meeting that weren't yet connected. So I think that, we've built a tremendous amount on what exists, and there's so much work to now stitch that together.
Yeah.
That's great. So Dorn, talk to us a little bit about how much open source has entered the mainstream in agriculture.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question because it certainly has felt in the last in the last 5 years or decades, certainly, that it's gone from something that was more sort of fringe to something that is central, and especially as we're moving towards agriculture needing to address the much more the complexity of climate change, and we're asking agriculture to do so much more. The level of collaboration and then the complexity and interoperability that's required for the next generation of agriculture is really requiring the open source approach. So it's really moved into a core component of measuring, and not just in the automation side, but also in the environmental monitoring and so forth. It's being adopted by some of the largest food companies in the world as they try to as we move towards to trying to have credibility, because one of the key things when we start to measure environment is it's not a marketing claim. You actually have to verify it. In order to be verified, it has to be trusted, and for science to be trusted, we have to have some transparency. We have to have provenance in the data. So I think in that sense, we've seen a huge movement towards the open source platforms and interoperability. And I don't think there's really another way to achieve those goals. So it's, I think we're just on the cusp of it being the way in which open science and agricultural science is done.
That's great to hear. So Melanie, the students of yours that we saw featured in the film are now graduating seniors, I believe. Mm-hmm. So what is next for them, like for the food ecosystem? Where are they headed?
Yeah, so one of the things we do in the food computer classes, we build the food computers, they grow, and at the end of each growth cycle, the students will harvest and then cook with whatever we've grown in them. And so they've been doing this over the past year, and every time we do it, you can see the students kind of like getting more into it, like developing their own recipes. So they were able to run a pop-up restaurant at a local food hall in Baltimore. And as we were kind of building up that process, you could see a lot of students like clicking in their mind, like, oh, here are like things that we can do as a real job. Like people are lining up to buy our food, and like we're making a lot of money and like not a lot of time. So like, we're onto something. So I think one of the coolest stories from that experience was Ariel, who's in the film. She was the person who had to like put all the sandwiches together, and she like looked over and she saw this huge line, and she like looked at the person next to her, and she's like, we're successful, like we should run our own restaurant. And so so I think a lot of students are kind of like looking into stuff like that. Like Ariel is like looking into running a restaurant. There's another student in the class who is like wasn't planning on going to college, but now he's applying to culinary school because he like thinks that is like his true calling. Another student is interested in doing kind of like landscape architecture stuff.
Oh, cool.
So there are a lot of different facets, and I think like Tim, who is in the film, he'll tell you, he's like, I'm really into sports, like I'm gonna be a PT person, I'm gonna go to school for that because I really like it, but he's like, but I also think this computer stuff is pretty cool, and it's like, not that hard, so like maybe I'll incorporate that into something. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah.
And they probably had no concept of that before your class, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like I don't know, they'd probably had some exposure to plant science in general, but incorporating the technology and urban agriculture and kind of what you can do in the food system as a whole is totally changed their view, I think, or their view has changed from it.
That's cool. And Peter, what's next for Mars Farm?
Yeah, so the mission and end goal of Mars Farm is to grow plants on Mars, and really the now of that is crowdsourcing experimentation and creating a lot of instances of climate, and then working with different schools, because schools, through our curriculum, we can really mandate what data they collect in manual observations, whether that be the size of the leaves, the distance between the branches, things like that help us to understand what crops should be selected, as well as what environments should be used to reproduce that plant consistently. If you think of a 52 Napa Valley grape, that was a very unique expression of temperature, drought, humidity, CO2, altitude. All of that combined created a unique expression. So we want to enable students to take a plant like bok choy and say, how do we reduce the amount of roots that are unedible and increase the amount of edible biomass to make it a more efficient grow. So things like that really is the now of collecting the back end data and really leveraging that to actually answer real questions.
Great. Okay, so question for all of you now. We'll start with Melanie. So what do you see the role of open source playing in the future of our food system?
Yeah, so obviously open source is totally necessary for things to be evolving. Like similar to what Dorn was saying in the film, you need this collective knowledge of stuff, and you need people who are doing one thing and doing trial and error, and someone else is doing that, so you can build on top of that and then apply that back to like, okay, how am I going to use this in my system? How can I use this in a school, or how can I use this outside versus inside, or a soil versus hydroponic? And so like kind of building on this collaborative nature and kind of like Dorn was saying, like connecting all these different components and making it really accessible for people. Because I think there's a lot of tech out there, and a lot of people understand the tech, but a lot of people don't. So like, how do you kind of bridge all those components together while like keeping that open source collaborative nature alive?
That's great. Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think from a macro consumer point of view, there's a real desire in our food system for transparency and a creation of trust and a feeling of personal relationship with the farmer. So that whole concept of personalized food and bringing that food system closer, local, fresh, natural, all of these are terms we use, but they're not really defined very well. And I think open source offers a level of transparency that's unparalleled in terms of this is really the origin location of the food. Therefore, when there's an outbreak from that region due to a cow wandering onto the field, we can actually trace that throughout the food supply chain. So I think we'll see, tools like blockchain be utilized to create transparency. We'll see in the field many tools already being leveraged that are built upon open source frameworks and are having further frameworks developed currently. So I think all throughout the supply chain we'll see its influence, not just in agriculture.
Great. And Dorn?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the future of agriculture is really being redefined and combining with, just as we talked about in the film, sort of redefining who's a farmer. I think part of this is also redefining who's engaged in research and science, because the future of agriculture is really understanding these underlying systems, and that happens at all scales. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the exciting thing, is that it's not, it's sort of adapting to our environments, using our global knowledge for local production at whatever scale. I think the only way to achieve that is really through interoperability that's made possible from open source. So I don't see the future of science and system science, because we're at the end of sort of a reductionist way of viewing things. In order to make this progress, it has to be systems based. So I see the future of science and agricultural science, climate science, and agriculture as being combined, and that open source is the way in which it is done, not an option or
That's great. Well, thank you. We have a few minutes to open it up to the audience. If we have questions in the audience, raise your hand. We do have a microphone that we're going to pass around. We are filming the panel to share it on our newsletter, so we want to make sure to capture your questions.
Hi, my name is Karina, and I have a company called Footprint Africa, and we work all over the African continent. My question for the panel is, there are a number of very similar projects happening around the world, and specifically in Africa. How do we get all these various projects to work together so that we don't keep on reinventing the wheel? For example, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and various NGOs have been working very closely with small farmers in Africa, where they have various probes in the soil, looking at the quality of the soil, looking at the humidity, looking at the weather patterns and then distributing various seeds depending on what's happening at that time. So if there's not going to be a lot of rain, for example, for the next 3 months, they do quick growing, quick producing seeds to produce quick crops so that the people can eat and that the village or the district can have food for that time. So my question is, how do we all work together so that we don't reinvent everything and we use each other's knowledge and build on that?
Who'd like to start?
I'd be happy to jump in. It's interesting that the project that I mentioned, the Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management, has a number of partners that are working internationally, and some of that is, and what we're discovering is that the same technology that we're using to measure soil and climate and map it and communicate it is really, a lot of that underlying logic is language independent. And in fact, even the interfaces that were the next generation interfaces are native language interfaces, and we have now open source tools to facilitate that much faster than I think we ever realized. So we can instantly translate results into hundreds of languages from the start, rather than as an afterthought maybe in 20 years. It's something that can happen almost now. So I think they're providing access to those shared libraries and services, software services that can be used in software development kits that can be localized for the particular production system, but also recognize that as much as a climate is unique in a part of Africa or a part of India or a part of the Northeast US or the Southern Plains or in Australia or South America, there's actually a lot common. Even though they're geographically distributed, it's finding those and linking those people together. So I think part of this is that, yes, we have this underlying technology, but the other big piece of open source technology is the communications and collaboration to create those peer-to-peer connections. So it's not just the hardware and software, but the other things that we said that we're all building on and creating those connections with others in their communities to adapt for their own use.
Yeah, I would say also, like how I got interested in the food computer was through the group at MIT, and they created this forum where people can go on, make a new thread or start a new category about something that they've done with a food computer or hydroponics or Raspberry Pi or Arduino, whatever, and they're like, oh, I have a problem with this that I'm trying to build, like who can help me with it? And so that was really instrumental, I think, in people not only like realizing what that was, but also to get interested and to realize like, okay, I don't have to do this by myself. If I need a question answered, I don't have to like go to someone who's a programmer. I can go onto this website and probably find the answer somewhere. So I think that kind of builds a good model for something that could be done in terms of connecting different people and say, here's a central place where you don't have to ask necessarily one person about how do you do this thing, but you can say, in general, I know this collective group of people has this knowledge. Who can help me with it and how can you do it? It's a little bit like a free-for-all area. So if you're on the website, you kind of have to look, or if you know something, you might have to search for it. And so that probably needs to be a little bit more structure if you're saying like there are people all over South Africa, or there are people all over the US or Europe, and like how do you like organize it maybe in a better way? But I think that's a good kernel for like a good prototype for something that needs to happen, but like more on a structured global scale.
Yeah, I wish I had the immediate answer for your question. I think what I've learned through my foray into all of this is that there's a lot of problems in agriculture. And those problems can get political, and those problems can vary greatly based on geographical regions, cultures, and even the definition of success. For example, is reduction of inputs the goal, or is increase in yield, or is it nutrition, or is it flavor? So when you have different competing goals, it becomes very difficult, which is why through Mars Farm, really, we see ourselves as having an opportunity at helping to create that commons, because we're rather than focusing on a problem, it's more of an idealistic solution that isn't at odds with the current food system. And we're not trying to come in as disruptors, but we're rather looking towards something that has yet to be done and focusing on very specific use cases that aren't broad enough to be, I don't want to say wishy-washy, but can oftentimes just be hard to see the relevance to the individual.
I wanted to add one more particular example that I failed to mention. One of the tools within the Open team is a project called Land Potential Knowledge System, which is actually started in Africa to map in higher resolution so that people can map their own soils. That software was developed in that context, and it's actually being deployed now in large-scale agriculture in the US. And so I think that sort of illustrates a pathway where these same tools, regardless of scale, can actually be applied. And I think that's where we're headed, is because the general architecture, the data architecture of the process is really scale independent. And so the largest scale producers are going to be able to be using the same data pathways as the smallest scale.
I think you hit it on the head with industry, and there needs to be a red hat of ag, you know? Really, though, even at just a consulting level.
So we have time for one last quick question, if there's another one from the audience.
Yeah, hi. I noticed in this presentation about some of the complexities that is being faced. Definitely the changing weather is one. We saw the aging out of farmer is also another challenge. One important thing is like that with the change of weather, we see there are a lot of water crises happening in a lot of different countries across the world. Now with the depleting water in the underground layer, as well as changing pattern of rains, at the same time, the cost of affordability from the farmer's perspective is also another complexity that is being, visible across. So, what is open source community is trying to do today to solve problems with these additional complexities?
So I think one of the things that I've learned in this whole process of looking into food computers and different ag tech, that people realize that this is a problem. So the reason why hydroponics and aeroponics and aquaponics are gaining traction is because you can plant the same amount of stuff in a smaller space and using less water. And so how can we, to both of these guys' points, how can we optimize the conditions for that in different areas? And what is the objective? Is the objective for a plant to use less water? And so if that's so, can we make basically an aeroponic, a sprinkler system inside? So we're using very minimal water, but what's the threshold for that in the plants? And then how can we track that data and then share that with everyone else? So I think that's a problem that people are looking into, and obviously no one solved everything yet. But
yeah, I'll say Open Ag especially, and if you just go on Google and search Open Ag forums, you'll find them. They especially have focused on hydroponics, aquaponics, aeroponics, whatever you want to call it. And I think that is, when we're talking about water, a very interesting thing to be pursuing. In addition to that, I'll say that right now, in most of the world, there's a lot of inefficiency in the genetic potential of a seed. So it could produce tenfold what it actually did produce, and whether that's due to other inputs not being put at the right time, lack of education, there's a number of reasons, but I think increasing that is the most important thing, because that plant's still utilizing the same amount of water, but you're yielding a far smaller proportion of that. So I think increasing that efficiency through education, as well as using other systems and adopting seed for those systems, namely hydroponic.
And I would add, since our work is really at the landscape level and looking at it even at the modeling full watersheds, that it really is about decision support and taking all that complexity and translating it into action. And that is done through making a lot of the existing systems and analytics and libraries accessible. But in order to make that useful, there's a certain minimum amount of data that needs to be collected at a high resolution to provide that back to farmers. And I think that's part of where we're at right now is creating decision tools with near real-time environmental feedback. So if you have large-scale water events, what is the effect on the nutrient cycle? How what nitrogen is going to be retained from the previous crop, and being able to model that and then make recommendations based on the appropriate, the next season. What's the projected forage yield for your grazing animals? What would be a good plant to interseed because you're in the middle of a drought, but you still need to produce something. And so I think narrowing down all those decisions is something that we can do really well, and we can almost do it now. We just haven't created usable interfaces. It's living in academia right now, and so I think it's translated. Even the most experienced agronomists struggle with this kind of thing, and yet that's something I think is sort of low-hanging fruit to make it manageable and accessible.
Thank you. So I want to thank Dorn and Melanie and Peter, not only for joining us here today, but for all of the time and accessibility you gave us working with us on this film. So thank you so much.
Thank you.